I do love competing in mixed gender contests because, you know, the way that the judging is done, whether it's intended or not, is highly subjective towards the idea of the way a certain gender should surf.
Totally.
So I'm scored much differently if I'm surfing in a mixed gender heat, because there's the way that I surf when I'm viewed against this like style, grace, a feminine idea of what surfing should be in a women's heat. Some of the stuff I'm doing is viewed as being out of control. When I'm judged in a group of men, it's viewed as being radical or progressive. And I can feel that. The contests where I've done the best have been, not all, but like have been kind of set up that way. So I really appreciate being in that sort of environment. I don't think that's the case for, not that every contest should be that way.
Yeah.
But I think that it allows one judging criteria to come through that isn't catered to our preconceived idea of like what that gender should do it like.
I also don't know how much an advantage, you know, the different body types have even in surfing, you know, especially particularly longboarding. I think it's technique. Technique is everything, you know?
Yeah, they definitely don't. I mean, it's like, the privilege that we have in surfing is its subjectivity, and that we can almost leave that conversation at the door because it doesn't affect surfing, particularly in longboard surfing.
Yeah.
Maybe you could make that you could make a case for that point of view in shortboarding. It is a bit more physically demanding, but then you have a 14-year-old girl, Erin Brooks, like whipping whipping men's butts when she gets the chance to compete against them. So I really find, or Sarah Lurback, you know, there's just like, there's so much evidence of women winning in mixed gender situations.
Carissa Moore won multiple heats, beat Daniel Thompson, who's a phenomenal shaper and surfer. You know, it's when she was like 17, you know?
So I see this being thrown around by people who force themselves into the conversation about who should be competing in what division in women's sports. Like,
men mostly.
Yeah, are you guys Title IX advocates as well? Like, since when have you cared so much about women's sports?
Exactly.
You seem to me to be a fisherman from, okay, never mind.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go down that route. But a lot of times the argument against trans and gender diversity inclusion in women's division is about young girls and the fact that they'll never be able to beat a man.
Yeah.
But it happens all the time. And so in longboarding in particular, we have the benefit of being able to create a space where everyone is welcome, because there is, in my mind, not an inherent benefit. Now, that's not even getting into conversations about biology and what's true or not true in those conversations about biology itself. But even if you're going to accept the idea of some kind of male physical superiority and its relevance to this conversation, it does not get borne out in competitive surfing. I haven't seen it. And the idea that, like, I mean, that just these women's divisions are so competitive at the elite level that the idea that there is like a bevy of mediocre men willing to be trans for a day and they can just come in and steamroll this competition is insane. I mean, one of my best friends, Sasha Jane, who you've had on the show, love her to death.
Yeah, she's fucking cool.
Dog sitting my baby right now, who is my most precious angel.
Hi, Sasha.
So we love her so much. And she is an amazing surfer.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to say this to not, she of course has the capability to win on any day, but so does anybody else.
Yeah.
The idea that she is unbeatable because she has some inherent physical advantage is just a joke. I mean, it's like nobody's going to protest Honolulu showing up to a contest because she's going to win. It all comes down to this idea of protecting the right to win and this idea of female mediocrity, this inherent female mediocrity, which I really, really, really resent, because I think it overlaps with the conversation about female shapers, of this idea that there is an inherent, that, and goes back to the second sex and Simone de Beauvoir, of like, there's this inherent male primacy. And I really resent that. And I also resent the idea that women are inherently mediocre.
I agree. Like, I find it, when I hear these arguments and I'm like, but it's where is that line of fairness then? Well, I mean, why is it fair? Okay, what if you had like a 6'4" woman who surfed? Is that an unfair advantage because she has more weight than someone who's 5 foot? You know, and it's like, no, there, especially in surfing, there's no, you know, sometimes being bigger, stronger is actually a disadvantage. Even, you know, there are so many different variables that you can't reduce it down to just gender, and that's what I think.
As I was saying before, there's a bias, whether they're aware of it or not, in a lot of judging in the gender divisions, where there's a way that women's surfing is viewed versus men's surfing, and there's a prioritization towards like this grace element. And that is in disservice of some, you know, of, again, this is a fake straw man thing, but of the quote unquote, a sign, I don't know. I don't even know how I want to say this because I'm speaking in somebody else's a straw man projection of somebody else's bias. But if you want to say like this idea that like a biological man, which is again not accurate to what I'm saying,
you're just using the words that they
has
use.
A physical advantage in a woman's division is just not true.
Yeah,
I would say I have a more conventionally masculine style in my surfing. It is not necessarily favored in a women's division. Not to saying that I'm better than the women I'm surfing against.
It's different,
but it's different, and the criteria is subjective, and it doesn't necessarily suit somebody who doesn't fit into this narrow definition of a woman.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I you know, partly bringing this up because it's become a bit of a lightning rod again of a topic recently with the longboard, the U.S. longboard tour, or whatever it's called.
Oh, don't make it sound so grandiose.
Yeah,
there's a bit
of
like I think that a lot of that got a lot of credibility because of the intentional choosing of a generic sounding name for this contest.
Yeah, exactly.
Without getting into too many specifics about these conversations, because I don't want to give too much airtime or importance to too much PR to some of these contests that have come out with very poorly thought out, very poorly rolled out decisions. And I know you on this podcast have talked at length about the details of some of the good policies that have come out, like from the ISA. So
absolutely.
What really bothered me about that conversation that came up recently was the trying to pass it off onto the ISA as if it was their policy. I mean, for once, we have actually a good policy that was done in concordance and the right conversations were had. Don't act like it doesn't exist. Don't hide behind something and say it's something that isn't. So there's so...
and the gaslighting. That's the other thing.
So much
really
gaslighting.
Annoying.
The thing that there's there's so many things that really bother me about this. And I mean, I have one comment on that thread that has something like 175 responses. Never so much. But there's these bad faith actors who do not have women's best interest in their heart using my name in order to promote what I see as their bigotry.
Yeah.
And it's a common occurrence. I think it overlaps, again, like with the way that we see a redefinition around what anti-Semitism is, to be anti-Zionism.
Yes.
And these are two things that I really resent as a woman and as a Jew. I really resent this hate being spread in my name.
Exactly.
And more than anything else, this is what really bothers me. I do not like people who do not have women's best interest in heart defining what it is to be a woman. Because what has started happening, and you see it on this post from the quote unquote American Longboard Association, because I don't agree with the view of what a woman is that they are representing, it's like my woman card has been revoked. So there's been because I don't fit their definition of a woman, is it not being done in my name to protect me? So why am I, as a competitive female longboarder, now no longer included in this group that you're speaking to protect? I find that highly offensive.
Absolutely. You know, and they're using it and they're weaponizing this whole thing for their own agenda, which has nothing to do with the benefit of women in competitive surfing.
It prevents also the actual women of competitive surfing having a conversation with each other. And this is what really bothers me is the rage baiting and whatever. the people in the conversation with the loudest points of view have nothing to do with competitive surfing. I do think that if you are a female competitive longboarder and you have an opinion on this, and it's not one that I necessarily agree with, you should have the ability to speak and we should be able to have a conversation. But when you have this like hyper polarization happening, it drowns out those voices and it makes the people who might disagree but want to know more and have a conversation unable to enter it.
Yeah.
It makes it just like these, particularly these public declarations of policy around these surf contests are launched in a way that does harm.
Yeah.
It's not even necessarily about the policy and whether it's good or bad.
It's about
but it's a
hurting people.
dehumanization and a unwillingness to see the person at the other end of the conversation. And yeah, it doesn't allow us to talk with each other, and it really drives me crazy because I would love for it to be a real conversation.
Yeah. It's frustrating, especially like when they roll it out and they blatantly say it in the policy where they don't need to say it.
I think what's at threat here and why you get so much hostility from a certain type of guy around this policy is its defense of the male gaze and its place in surfing. And the idea that like it's a defense of the ability to gaze upon a hot girl in a bikini and like objectify her.
Yeah.
And I think that they're so threatened by the idea of trans women entering that space is because, well, what if you don't know?
Yeah.
Then you've been ogling somebody that you might,
and then you question your own sexuality, and then it's like makes you feel insecure and all that ridiculous stuff that
Yes.
these guys have.
So there's kind of like a making obvious what was like kind of hidden under the table about that one in particular. And then I think that sometimes too, not that I think that the beliefs are all a put on. I think people can come to beliefs that I disagree with all on their own. But a contest that had absolutely a contest that had very little reach. I'm talking about the newer
other
one that has
Yeah.
come up to have a problematic policy, in my view, on that tail is what great PR for them. How much
Yeah.
attention did they get to that post and that content? The engagement through the roof.
Yeah.
And whereas that was a conversation that could have been had one-on-one.
They could have gone right to Sasha and talked instead of blowing it out and
Treat her like a human
Yeah.
being. You want to make the argument that this is about defending women's sport, not about hatred, then treat this amazing person and this
Yeah.
amazing surfer like a fucking human being.
Exactly.
Oh, you have their email, you have their Instagram, you have a million ways to contact them. You have had their entry fee for 2 months. You've known that they were entering for 2 months. You have all of their contact details. Reach out to them in person. These conversations, when they're had publicly in this way, with where the rhetoric gets to and
causes
the
so
rage
much-
baiting causes so much harm. And these conversational spaces, when they're done on Instagram like that, are not safe spaces for trans or gender diverse people to enter the conversation. So it is up to, the cis women like me to be out there having this conversation. And in the way that like the civil rights movement needed allies, because it's dangerous for them to be there. I mean, the idea of like, oh, well, who's being harmed because they're being kept out of a surf contest? It's like, it's not about that. The harm is being done on this thread. And to think that there aren't real world consequences for that language is absurd. You have
Absolutely.
kids in America being beat up at school.
Bullied, they're
Dying.
they're committing suicide, they are depressed,
So who's really at harm
Yeah.
here?
Exactly.
The idea of a 16-year-old girl who might be beat in a contest. Well, that 16-year-old girl was going to be beat in that contest or they were going to win. It's anybody's day. It doesn't, if you want to use teenagers as your excuse for why you can't let people into the contest, then maybe we need to be having a larger conversation about pro divisions and whether or not there should be an age limit if
Yeah.
it's so precarious. Because if you're going to say a 13-year-old girl shouldn't be competing against X, Y, or Z, well, then maybe if that 13-year-old girl can't handle the idea of being beat, then they shouldn't be competing at a professional level. And we are talking about the professional level here. And there's this idea of protecting the right to win. It just drives me crazy. Like, is somebody's life not important? If you really believe in the value of competitive surfing and surfing in general, why would you want to deny that to somebody? And if you're willing to create a hierarchy of who gets access and who gets denied that, then you're making a judgment about who is and isn't a person.